Okay. Todd McGowan, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, James, thanks for having me. I always love to be here.
And it will be New Year's Eve. So everyone have a great night of excess. So I made sure it's going to go live on New Year's Eve for two reasons. One, we're talking about your book, Pure Excess, Capitalism and the Commodity, which I believe is being released on New Year's Eve. And also, it's a book about excess. It's a book about commodity form. And what greater night of the failure of excess than New Year's Eve, right? Are you a New Year's
Right,
Eve guy?
right. It was always the most depressing holiday for me.
Yeah. Because you can't do it, because you just can't.
Right. Yeah. Like I would try to go have a great time, and I never managed to do that successfully.
So okay. Well, firstly, thanks to Columbia University Press for sending me the advanced copy of this. So big thank you to them. I have to ask before we get, is this a sequel to Capitalism and Desire?
Well, it kind of started that way, and then it sort of took off on its own, and now I feel like it's almost more a prequel, like it's more primary than Capitalism and Desire. I feel like now, but I don't know. But I did start out thinking of it as a kind of a sequel, and I think the editor at Columbia had the same idea because I don't know if you noticed this, but the cover is almost
That's
exactly the
that's
same.
actually why I asked. I mean,
Yeah.
you say it's kind of different. I wouldn't have asked that question, but when I finally went back and looked at the cover, I was like, hang on, that's basically it's red instead of blue. So that's why I asked, because I was thought, is this going to be a series or something like that? But
Yeah.
yeah, and that's another question. Just before we get into the book, do you feel you're starting to have a praxis adjacent project now? Because this book felt more like you're gearing up to. It didn't feel completely self-contained. It felt like very accessible. The writing was a bit more simple than usual, and it felt that it was gesturing towards, like, down the line, be something more like praxis or practical things people can do.
Maybe. I mean, I do have a kind of suspicion about drawing a roadmap for what I should do or people should do. But I do think that, I mean, this is a question everyone asks me in every uh, interview I do. So I guess that's kind of gotten through and that I've sort of moved more in that direction. I mean, I think we talked about the alienation book, and I feel like that also had more of this kind of that moving in that direction. So yeah, so I think that's probably true. And I think especially in the last chapter of this book, which is about artistic, I don't know if it's so much I hope it is like a collective notion of praxis, but I had many people say to me that they looked at Capitalism and Desire as a self-help book. And so I I guess I kind of leaned into that a little bit and thought, okay, well, if that's what it is for people, then I'll just make it that. And I also and I'm glad that you picked up, like I did try to make it, and this has been something I've tried to do all of my life consciously, but even more so in the last few years, is to make my writing more accessible and not make it just confined to a certain academic hermetic group, because I don't know, I just that's not that interesting to me. So
Well,
and I hate jargon. I've always hated jargon. So I tried to really, I think there's one footnote where I mention like objet a and das Ding, but that's the only, it's only in the footnote. Everything else is put in these other terms. And so
well,
I think that's
it came through. It's very, yeah. I explicitly noticed that it was very accessible. So you're just writing a long string of sophisticated self-help books.
yeah, I think that's probably true. Right. I mean, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think like, you could read The Republic as a self-help book
Mhm.
too. So I feel like, okay, if that's what it is, that's what it is. I'm not, I just don't think, I think it's important to allow people to define what you are. And then, because I don't think when you're writing something or when you're talking, like you don't really know what you're saying. And so
Mhm.
when people respond to you, they're hearing what you're saying without you knowing it because it's unconscious. And so I'm like, okay, I'll respond. That clearly is what I'm interested in. And so I'll
Mm.
pursue that.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is a book about capitalism. Capitalism is defined by constantly needing excess and the ever elusive and impossible paradoxical more. and also the commodity form. So the commodity form is sort of the most explicit structure of like the the thing that we can perhaps define. So if we're gonna like that, it's circling around as like that's
Yeah.
something we can point to. So what's the commodity form? I just
The
let that.
commodity form is a form that I mean, you already said it in a sense. Like it's a form that promises excess without any loss or suffering. So actually, as the title of the book says, it's a promise of pure excess, and that's why people invest themselves in the commodity. And I think that that form defines the capitalist system. The book was originally going to be called Capitalism in the Commodity Form, but Columbia thought no one knows what the commodity form is.
Mhm.
That has to go. So, but I obviously liked that title because I feel like it also the title was going to be the critique of pure excess, but they didn't like that Kantian flourish. So yeah, anyway, I feel like it's that promise of pure excess that is the commodity form, and that my point is that works both on the production side, like on what you're when you're investing in a company or when you're even starting a company, and then it also works on the consumption side when you're buying a commodity to use or to invest in, but even just to enjoy, right?
Sure. So the commodity. So if I got this right, because I want to get this. Not everyone reads Marx these days,
Yeah.
right? So
Well,
commodity.
this isn't doctrinaire Marx, I don't think,
No,
right? Like
I
I
was
think
gonna ask. Are
yeah.
you tweaking again?
Yeah, I mean, I think someone said to me that they had read this book in its draft form, and
Mm.
they said this is your most Marxist book, and I think that is probably true.
Mm.
But it's also the one that like I'm not just like for Marx, the commodity is about surplus value, and so for him, it's tied. That surplus is just it's economic, right? And
Mhm.
but for me, it's also a psychic surplus as well, and that's why. And I think that's why the economic surplus gets us. You know, like that's why we're caught up in it. I think if it was just an economic surplus, we could manage to not be so invested in it.
Yeah. So we could define just a commodity without that form part, which is probably key. Is the key sort of the key part? Commodity and an object or item of use.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And then
Well, I think it's important. No, I think it actually is an object that's taken out of use, right? Like I think and I think Marx is very good on this. Like he talks about the difference between exchange value and the use value of something. So the commodity really is in a way this difference between the exchange value and the use value. So it's not like for me it's important that what's valuable about the commodity, and here it's a little different than Marx, I think, that what's valuable about the commodity is what's not useful. And that's something that kind of came to me from psychoanalysis and different things. And I think that's maybe the central idea running through the book and the really the maybe the redefinition of the commodity and the value in the commodity as precisely that which resists being reduced to use. And I think that really, if you want to understand like how capital functions and why we live
yeah.
in the midst of this incredible excess and at the same time incredible poverty, I think that's really the key, is to see the way in which uselessness or what can't be reduced to use is like driving our existence.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask you to retell the Oreo story to give it?
I
Because I think it's a perfect example, right?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So, so I felt like maybe I was doing this a little too long on this personal anecdote, but
No,
um,
it made me understand it because I think it's an intuitive and fairly elusive idea that is that story, that the Oreo tale, which you'll tell for me is like I get it now because I've personally experienced it, right?
you had a similar experience. Yeah, you told me that, and I really loved that because I was a little worried that this was a little too idiosyncratic, and so I'm just happy that you're the first person I've talked to that's read the book that's like, oh, I've had that same experience. So when we were kids, we would sometimes take like really long, not really long, but long drives, vacation, overnight vacations, and my parents weren't wealthy, and so they would buy like 3 or 4, and they didn't have there was not yet a family size Oreo, so the package of Oreos were kind of small, and my mom would buy 3 or 4 packages of Oreos, and she would put them in order because she didn't want to take all those different packages. She put them all in a big plastic bag, and she'd bring them along. And then one of the things whenever we'd get ready to stop for dinner or lunch or whatever, my mom would say, okay, she'd give us the Oreos then, and she'd say, eat up and spoil your dinner, because they didn't want us to, otherwise my brother and I, we just ate too much. And so, but the one thing we noticed was and this is the only time we got to eat Oreos. We never had them up, but except we were at our friend's house. And the one thing we noticed was out of the package, they tasted great. But when she put them in this plastic bag, they tasted, and I was just talking to my brother about this the other day, and he was like, God, they were just terrible. They just lost all their taste altogether. And we were like, well, it's because of the plastic or whatever. But then we did some experiments later, and it actually the plastic doesn't actually change the taste. But what changes the taste is that it loses this, the packaging, like it gets detached from the packaging. And I think that's it was to me such a fascinating revelation about what creates the value of the commodity, that there's and I think so many commodities come like this now, right? Like this plastic packaging with the vacuum seal. And it's like the emptiness around the object is what gives it the value. And then once you open the seal, then that value is taken away. And then what made me think, what's also interesting about this, right, is that when you're returning something, oftentimes, if you've opened the package, you can't return it because it's lost. Like, what's the difference, really? Oh, no, it's lost this little seal. That's all it's lost. And this empty space around the object. And so that, for me, that was why the Oreos were such a great example for me, because it was this thing in my own life where I really experienced this loss of the purity of the excess, which was created by this vacuum seal around the object.
Which is an identity, right? Like you're trying to form an identity. I mean, just to relay why that was so, I sympathize with that so much. My grandma used to, very frugal working class woman, she'd buy multiple packs of biscuits, what you call cookies.
Cookie, yeah, you could.
And I don't know I'm sure this probably is common in America as well, but she was the kind of woman who'd bake cakes and put them in old tins.
Yeah.
So for her, biscuit tin was just like an old Cadbury's Roses tin. And she used to open all these biscuit packets with her nails. She had really long nails. So she's sliced along them. And she'd go, oh, do you want some biscuits? And she'd come in, open the packet, and pour them all into this horrible... And I'd just be like, I don't really... And then you'd look in it, it'd be all the broken old ones. I'd be like,
Right.
But that lasted like a month, because you'd be like, oh yeah, I guess I'll have one. I'm hungry. But if they would, there was a lot of that, and I wonder how new. Do you think this is relatively new? Because she was from an era where, in a way, that it feels like that sort of possession, that psychological possession of the commodity form, hadn't really fully taken root. Like they still had a connection to like she had a plot of land to grow veg kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So. It hadn't fully. Do you think it's fairly new?
Yeah, I think I think you're right. I think that, it only makes sense that as capitalism develops, its logic becomes more predominant, right? I think you're right that maybe in our grandparents' generation, that I think we're rough. You're younger than me, but that use still had more of a role to play, right? But I still think it's not that use under capitalism is never the source of value. It can be a concern, right? There can be more of a concern for use. And I think your grandmother had more of a sense, my parents had more of a sense of use, but I still think it's not the source of what's valuable. I think once capitalism enters the scene, then value is attached to what's excessive and what's not reducible to use. And I think it's really interesting how so many theorists of capitalism think that it gives us what's useful. That's the great thing about it for them. And I just want to say, no, it's the opposite. If it gives us what's useful, it's just kind of incidental, right? I think, I think the real capitalists are the venture capitalists, the people that are building luxury cars or yachts. Those are the people that are really driving the capitalist system. And the people that are giving us food and shelter, they're kind of they're not really telling us what the actual logic of the system is, because it seems like they're giving us things that are useful. That's why I think.
Well, and I think, as helpful as the Oreo story is, I think your example of books with sleeves is the perfect example, because if we were to rationally think about books, we would say, right, well, the reason we buy a book is to read the words, which is the content, which could be printed off like some horrible sheets or sent on a PDF,
Right.
or and there's all these different editions. But as you pointed out, when you go online, you look up an edition with or without the cover, which is that elusive thing you can put on the shelf and build up this identity of, be like, yeah, man, people are going to come around and they're going to look at my bookshelf, and I can't just have them look at like a horrible spine.
Right.
Right. But the point, it's such a strange thing to think about, because it makes you realize the use case, the content, that's almost last in line.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, in terms of the value of the thing, like I thought, to me, this is an example I used in the book. It really hit home when I had got Freud's standard edition, right? Like, it is, if the dust, this is not true now, but I think because there's a new edition of the standard edition, a revised edition out. So I think it's a little dated example, but maybe not. I mean, maybe the price is still the same. So to buy Freud's standard edition, they were no longer printing it new. They haven't been printing it new for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had the dust jackets intact, the covers intact, it was $1,000 more than if they were tattered or they didn't. And so it's like, how can that be like double the price for just the dust jackets? You're like, wait a minute, that can't be. You think to yourself, like, that can't be true, but it is true. So it's really a kind of like, you're right. Like that to me is an example and it's true of it's not just Freud. It's true of every, like, if you're collecting first editions or whatever, if you have the dust jacket intact, it's like multiple times in value as the thing without the dust jacket.
But this also does fall down. I'm just thinking about it now. I didn't think about this when I read your book, but just realizing this goes down right to the ultimate case of use, which is food. I don't know if you have the ugly veg thing in the US.
Yeah, we do.
Right. I think in the UK and I think in France, eventually it was in the news that they had to give away ugly veg, right? Like an ugly carrot, because we're not even buying the carrot. We're buying the.
Don't even buy it, right?
We're buying the perfect carrot.
Yeah, exactly true. I think I do. I think I only talk about food when I talk about the sticker that they put on the food as this thing that they add to it that doesn't add any value, or that adds value, but not any use, right? Like any utility. And so I think the ugly veg is a perfect example, because it's equally useful, but it lacks this excessive perfection, this aesthetic, right?
But it's also strange because there's something there about literally its aesthetic form, because take a carrot, you're going to peel it and chop it up, and then it's going to be indiscernible. So there's something about aesthetics, something about identity. Do you think it's to do with you are the kind of person who's probably got some little ideological image lodged of the brown paper American bag with like carrot tops sticking out the top? Do you think that has something to do with it? Certain imagery around commodities, that we're forming an idea of ourselves which is right, which is correct?
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly right, James. That I think that if you like the image of the commodity that you purchase is reflects who you are as an identity, right? Like, I think that's really true. That your own value is caught up in what commodities that you buy. And I think that's why, I mean, this whole way that the brand functions, right? It's not just a branding of the commodity, it's also a branding of oneself because of what commodities one buys. So I think that's really true. And that ties to the ugly vegetable thing perfectly, right?
How does this relate to excess? How does this relate to that more?
Right, because what the thing that you're attached to, and I think you're trying to convey yourself when you're branding yourself, for instance. I think this is maybe a lapse in the book, but I don't talk about this massive project of self-branding, because I was trying to talk about capitalism in a more global and long-term way. But this more recent phenomenon, like, I think you're trying to articulate a image of yourself as a pure excess, right? Like, without, look, and you're trying to, you're curating yourself as the image of yourself as without any lack at all. And even if you do allow for certain lacks to come through, they're always depicted as kind of in the end positive, right? So they're depicted as really, oh, that thing that seems like a lack, it's actually an excess. Right?
Could you give an example of that?
Yeah, like let's say I do this all the time when I'm teaching, and this you'll like this example just because you have this in common with me. I'll make a comment about baldness, and I'll say like, uh, just I have certain deficits, and one of them is my being bald, and that causes you to look at me. So but the fact that I like curate it in that way, right? Like that I make it into this, like what I'm trying to do. Of course, I don't think this to myself when I'm doing it, but what I'm trying to do is turn what seems like an obvious lack and make it into something that's excessive. That's part of my plenitude.
Yeah.
And that's something for people to identify with and like even, invest themselves in.
I think one of the amazing ways capitalism has done this recently is minimalism, right?
Yeah.
Minimalists become the maximalists. Minimalist lifestyle. It's incredible.
Absolutely. I think it's so nefarious, isn't it? Because you really seem like you're getting rid of like all of excess, but you're doing it in an excessive way, right? Like that's what's so complex about it.
So I wonder to what extent we've spoken before about limitations, and I think maybe in psychoanalysis, I think the limitation, the famous Freud quote that you love about hysterical despair transformed into everyday misery, right? That's our limitations. Like you're going to have this hard stop at your own general misery, but you're going to get there. And I think in the sense that capitalism can't deal with limitations, meaning can only really come from, as you've pointed out in your own work, some form of sacrifice, meaning in your life. And so when you also mentioned one of our last chats about how like you'd gone to see Wolverine, and I can't remember what it was, and you commented something like, problem is you can't do anything with it, right? And I wonder to what extent a lot of what capitalism is now producing, and I'm using that's pretty abstract, is the equivalent of Coke Zero, right? Like I can just drink this forever. It doesn't have any limitations. Marvel films can do whatever they want. They can go on. But in that sense, none of it means it's like a cigarette, right? It's just empty. It's like pure content. It's just you take it in and there's no nutritional value.
Yeah.
But that has like basically there can't be a limit in excess, which also means it's meaningless.
Right. No, I think it's exactly right. That meaning depends on a limit. And I think, and I really like what you're saying about this, like, it's almost pure content, right? Like, and I think if there's anything, like you've said, you began our conversation by saying that made us a turn to practice, right? And if there's something about the practice that I'm trying to work out here, it's the importance of form. And I think in a way, like capital and form is about limitation. And that's why I think there's a kind of allergy within the logic of capitalism to form and to the question of form and to like how form is necessary and actually structures and creates meaning, right? And I think that's why, like, one of the most lamentable developments in the history of art, I think, is the development of free verse, right? Like, it's just like, what does that mean? Because it's like you lose the limitation of form when you adopt free verse, right? Or when you like when you think like, oh, I can just paint without any kind of rule at all, like then you've lost the very limitation that makes art meaningful. And I think that's true about Coke Zero as well, like, or Diet Coke Zero, or I guess Coke Zero is Diet Coke Zero. That like you can just keep on drinking it infinitely, right? Because you're not getting, I mean, other than the cancer causing, which is, the cancer is kind of interesting too, right? Because cancer is pure excess without limitation. Like that's what those cells are. They no longer have the limitation attached to them, right? So I think there's a way in which if capitalism's products cause cancer, well, that they should, because that's really
cancer is the ultimate paradox of only being able to exist as that which eventually kills itself.
Right.
Do you, I mean, the problem there is we can't arbitrarily, you can't artificially create a limit, which I think is what a lot of current political movements are attempting to do with a return. Uh, Look at the past and say we should be that, which is like this. You can't artificially create that which arose organically in the past, right?
Right.
So, can we can we really say we've had enough? Like, all right, I'm done. I've had enough. Can we really say that, or are we fully possessed?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think that's really the question, right? Because I think you're right. You're absolutely right that these, and I sort of use Martin Heidegger as the great example because he's the smartest one of this, desire to return to return to use, basically, right? Like get out of this excess, return back to useful things. And I do this whole thing about Heidegger and the hammer. And but basically, like Trump is basically Heidegger. I mean, I don't mean to belittle Heidegger by comparing him to Trump, but like make America, like go back to some time, and like he wants. There's a certain. Although what's odd is he's such a figure of like purely meaningless excess. So
Mm.
that's why, unlike, I mean, I think Heidegger is much more genuine because there's less of like, clearly Trump is cheating. Like he wants the best of both worlds, right? Like he wants this excess, this pure excess, but then he wants to return to like rootedness in the blood and the soil, right?
Yeah.
Which you can't have it both ways, I don't think. So that seems to me, you're right that you can't go back in that way. But yeah, the question is like, can we introduce limits without without them being artificial and without them just mimicking the thing that we were just talking about earlier, this new minimalism? And I think like they could say, "Oh, we're introducing limits. Like we're kind of, and I feel like that, like both you and I would say, well, no, you're turning the lack of limits into its own form of X. You're turning minimalism into an excessive form. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's a great question, and I think that's one of the things That's one of the questions I was struggling with as I wrote the book. Like, and that's the last chapter is sort of an attempt to think through that. Like, are there not ways that I can just think up out of my head, but are there models for that I see in practice? And so one of the things that I looked at was the idea of the collection, right? Like this, does the collection, is that a way of thinking about form and limit in a non-artificial way that it just has grown up organically within the capitalist system, but that maybe challenges that logic of pure excess. So that was what I was trying to do in the end of the book.
Well, the collection is another proof again that the use value just doesn't matter at all, right?
Right, but that I think I think that's one of the ideas that I had in the book. Like, I think capitalism's right about that. That like use, who cares, right? Like, okay, yeah, we need enough use so that we don't starve to death. But I think capitalism is right that it's like it's excess that gives our life meaning, right? Like if I said, okay, you can live for 1,000 years, but you can't ever have an excessive experience, I don't think you'd take that deal, right? Like you'd be like, no, because it's the excessive experiences that really make our lives worthwhile. But what capitalism, this is the title of the book, what capitalism promises is a pure excess, whereas what we've talked about just earlier and before in other conversations is that every excess depends upon some kind of sacrifice. Like you have to suffer your excess. Like, and I think anyone who's a sports fan knows that you absolutely suffer. There's an incredible exhilaration, but it's mostly suffering. Like somebody emailed me and said, because of your podcast, I've gotten into Christmas films, but I've never been a sports fan, but I want to become a sports fan. Can you give me any advice? And my advice was, yeah, don't become a sports fan. It's terrible. It's not a good deal. It's like more suffering. You get this little bit of excess, but it's mostly suffering. And so I feel like that's the, and that's true in capitalism as well. So I guess part of what I would say is make this, the primary thing is to make this shift in our way of seeing things and see like, oh, wait a minute. No, I am making a sacrifice when I drink Diet Coke or when I drink Coke Zero, or when like there always is some kind of sacrifice involved that capitalism is blinding me to, and that I have to make visible and embrace and recognize. And that's where I think, so that's why I think it's organic. It's not like you're just coming up with something, right? You're seeing actually in what you do day to day the way in which, wait a minute, it's the suffering that actually is integral to this excess that I have.
But that still has to have a balance, because you mentioned sports. I think sports is key. It's probably actually the answer to the question of whether or not you can say you've had enough, because it's brought up a memory. My dad used to be really into Formula One. He used to get up really early when it was like in another country, so he'd be up at like 5. And then one Sunday or whenever it was on, he didn't get up, and I got up at like 9, and he'd only just got up. I said, "You didn't get up to watch Formula One?" And he goes, "No, Michael Schumacher always wins." And he just stopped. He stopped watching because there was no point anymore.
Right.
Because
Right.
the whatever that I guess for him, like the death drive element of like, is my underdog gonna fail? Like, I kind of know he probably is, but that's why I'm really here unconsciously. That was gone, because it's like this guy's, and he did. Like, Michael Schumacher won for like years on end, right? And
Yeah,
it just
I
ruined the
remember
whole
that.
thing. It ruined, like, what's the point? So I guess if
Caesar, you see, isn't that
well, it's like you said about if you said get into sports, you could make the decision to be like, that team always wins, I'm going to choose them. But you'd be bored like after like 2 years. But equally, if you choose the other one, you're like consciously choosing sort of death drive, like pain for yourself.
right? Right.
So you,
but that's which I think is perverse, right? So I think,
yeah,
but that's what's interesting about most sports fandom is you don't really choose. You're kind of born into it, right? Like you're born into it, and then you're sort of, and even when you pick, like I remember this so clearly. So I play tennis. I'm a tennis fan too, and I've always played since I was a kid, and my dad was a great fan, and and I remember I loved Roger Federer when he first started. Like, loved him. And then I was watching the 2008 Wimbledon, and I'm like, I saw Nadal playing him, and it was probably the greatest match that ever was played. And I just like, about in the fourth set or so, I'm like, I think I like Nadal more. And it's so I like I had I and but it wasn't like a conscious decision, right? Like it was something about the way Nadal played, and the way that he the level, like how hard he played, and just his refusal to quit. There's something about it. It spoke to me. And I think that's true always in sports. Like, you don't choose, either it's given to you by your family or something compels you about it. And I think one of the things that drives me crazy is people, and I live near the New England Patriots, which was for a long time the dominant football team in the US. And there are all these people that would move here, and then they'd change their fandom from their old team to the Patriots. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's just like this Michael Schumacher thing. Like, you can't, I'm like, how is that? How is that sports fandoms? It doesn't make, but I think you're right. It does show the error of pure excess, right? Like, it's no longer fun if the same guy wins every race. Yeah.
Yeah, if there isn't a lack.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But this makes me,
and even in its, don't you think it's true, James? Even an individual game, like you would think, like the most fun you'd have is your team is just destroying the other team, but you tend to turn it off. You're like, it's over. All this, I'm not interested anymore. Right?
Well, I said on a couple other podcasts to play on that Jacques Lecoin line, I said, if England win the World Cup, they're no longer England. Right? Like, they can't win. That isn't in the script. But it, to go back to, because you watched Wolverine and
I think it's Deadpool,
Wolverine, right? What do you think's going on there with this form of film that, for me, so I sort of almost hate bringing this into my podcast, like defiling it with these awful films, which are just pure content. But there was something interesting in, like, there was in the news articles, right, of that whole, lore of Marvel. Like, Tony Stark has been, I think he comes back or something after dying. And I remember thinking, could you really suspend disbelief that much that you can't realize, like, the studio can just do what they want, And so what do you think it is that, I mean, because these are big time selling, massively producing films, but these are films without any stakes, like there's always the anomaly that the hero wins. There really is not that sport type friction. Right. And once again, why are these so popular, do you think, in the realm of excess?
I mean, I think that they've bought in so much to the logic of pure excess and the people that go to them too. So I think that's part of it. But I do think that if there is a kind of waning popularity of the cinema, and I think it's in part maybe due to that, right? Like that there is, and there's a kind of Marvel fatigue
Mm.
in the world. And I think it's not, I think it's due in no small part to this lack of, and the Stark thing is fascinating, right? Because that death was such a, I mean, for one thing, it took 45 minutes of film time in the final Avengers movie. It was just unbearable. And I'm like, okay, he's dead. Let's get him out of there. But I feel like that is maybe part of the explanation why people don't want to go to, and like the length of those films is also unbearable, right? Like there's the notion of a tight 90-minute film that's gone too. And so I think all these things make it harder for people to go to the cinema, and then they just watch them on their streaming service, and then that's just part of this kind of just flow of excess, right? That you just there's no, because you can choose whatever. You know, there's no moment at which you experience your lack. Although, if you really know cinema, there's tons missing that you can never watch, which is really
How do you mean?
well. I mean, in the like, if you there's several. I mean, not just several. There's thousands of really good films that are just not available.
Okay.
Right? They're not available on any streaming service. They're just shelved. Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. I mean, it's not a, we think, oh, we're in this paradise of access to everything. But again, this is kind of like I mentioned the notion of a greatest hits album that always has one greatest hits,
Yeah.
one of the greatest hits missing. I think it's exactly true of the streaming service too. Like it's this promise of pure access. You can get everything on our streaming service, especially on something like Amazon Prime. But then, oh no, there's like, let's take a great director like Howard Hawks. There's 2/3 of Howard Hawks films you cannot get.
Okay.
So what is that? It's just, I mean, you can maybe go to Pirate Bay and get them, but that's a whole illegal thing.
Yeah.
So it's just, I think that's my point about the way lack kind of sneaks into the system, but isn't foregrounded, right? And I think, and so I feel like that's even true of a film like Deadpool versus Wolverine and Deadpool and Wolverine. I can't remember which it is. That there's lack is all the time in there. It's just never highlighted, and it's always obfuscated in certain ways.
I'm trying to think now of, because it was interesting when Game of Thrones first released, that one of the things people said was, oh, you need to watch Game of Thrones. Main characters die. Right, like that, it was the big thing when it was released. So I'm trying to think of films or TV shows. I mean, the ending of Sopranos is probably the best example, that betray the logic of excess, that give you such a. I mean, Sopranos, sure, but I wonder if you know of any other examples of like. But in that sense,
betray it.
But in that
challenge.
Sorry.
Challenge it.
Yeah, challenge it. But I guess at that point, in knowingly doing that, I guess someone like David Chase would know that. Maybe that's what it is that's upsetting the crowd, right? Upsetting the audience is confirming something that is true, but they don't want to admit it's true, that they have limits in their life.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Mad Men is one of the great instances of this, right?
I haven't seen it. So.
You haven't seen it. It's really good, and it's about these producers of excess, advertising, Madison Avenue advertising executives, and you're constantly seeing the way in which they're themselves like lack is essential to what's driving them. So I feel like that, to me, it's like one of the great examples. But I think Sopranos is a very good example because he seems to live a life you would think of pure excess, and then he's constantly confronted with how he's lacking, especially at the end, but throughout. I think all the great television series, television seems to be doing a better job than cinema at showing this. I mean, in cinema, you'd have to look historically, I think, because I think film noir that's what film noir does, really. It's showing how every figure of excess brings with them suffering and lack, and right, like that's what the noir hero encounters in the femme fatale. Like she's a figure of, it seems like this figure of pure excess who then brings about usually his destruction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Jumping back to the commodity form, I'll try stay on that. Uh, you say there's only equality after the commodity form. Why is this? Why is this? Sorry,
Because
that was a pretty janky sentence.
no, it's great. It's great. Yeah, because I think that what the commodity form introduces is it makes, and this is the point that Marx makes, it puts everything on the same level, right? Like all qualitative differences between things get reduced to the same thing in the commodity form. Like it doesn't matter. Like if you're a capitalist, you don't care if I if 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 uh if bananas are going to make you more money than broccoli. You're not attached to broccoli. You'll invest in bananas, right? Like it doesn't.
Mhm.
That's what I mean. Like the commodity form, like the value of the commodity form isn't attached to the quality of what the thing is, just to the excess of it. So it's a pure, then that really opens up this radical kind of equality, I think. So it is, I mean, this is a point that, again, this is a point that Marx makes, that it's only under capitalism that we get this a notion of equality. And I think I think that what he doesn't say is it's because of the commodity form that it really is the key to that.
There's something strange here, then, though, because we're talking about an excess which is useless. Is really
Yeah.
the what big key part of the logic of capitalism, ever elusive, eternal more. But at the same time, as we were talking about earlier, it's also that excess and more of ourselves, which is hidden often within a sort of often self-imposed lack, is equally where we find meaning. And so, how do you see the difference between those two forms of excess? Do you think capitalism is like abusing that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're right. I don't think, like, I think there's just been this whole Marxist critique of capitalism in the 20th century that's like capitalism has misdirected our desires into things that are bad for us, and we need to put it into things that are good for us. Like it's caused us to listen to music that sucks and not listen to Schoenberg, right? Like so there's that kind of like this would be the critique of Theodor Adorno or something like that. Or like Herbert Marcuse says, capitalism gets us to like confine our sexual relations to monogamy, and we need to like branch out and have, like there are all sorts of critiques about the way it directs our desire wrongly. But my point is, no, I don't. Who cares about that, right? Like, who cares about what our excess is? Like, I think excess is just. I don't think we necessarily need to judge between them. Like the excess is what gives every individual subject's life its meaning, and it does. So it could be what what the excess is that they get off on can be whatever. Who cares? But I think the lie of capitalism is that it presents this excess as if it's not tied to any lack or any suffering or any absence, right? Like it's a pure plenitude. And my point is what we need to shift is precisely this thinking about plenitude, that there is no pure plenitude, that every excess you have to suffer your way to it, like you have to sacrifice your way to it, and and that's what's happening. But again, capitalism clouds that over. So I think that's really, so in a way I think like this book kind of gives capitalism its due, I think, right? Like there's a real genuine insight about excess as the source of our significance of our lives. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. But I just think it's never a pure excess. And it's interesting. I think it's interesting how these billionaires are all like trying to find the secret of eternal life, right? Like they want to find this pure, because they're at the top and they're like,
Yeah.
okay, what is it now? I want to find this excess still doesn't seem pure enough. I'm going to find eternity, and that'll be a pure excess, right? This is why, interesting, I think Marx kind of succumbs to this at times, because I think he envisions the communist future as a future of pure excess. And so that's a point at which he buys into this
Mm.
fantasy himself, I think.
Do you see this? I mean, this is pretty open. I've got a film in mind that I might bring in, but do you see this in relation at one of these sides? So excess without capitalism. Do you see that as having a relationship with the death drive?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is that again, because I didn't want to, I was trying to make this book jargon free. I didn't ever use that term, but
Yeah.
I am going to write a jargony book called I'm in about 2/3 of the way through a book called Death Drive. So it will just actually be totally about this. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea, is that capitalism is the refusal of the death drive, or it's
Yeah.
the repurposing of it into a way that doesn't allow us to see the way in which our self-destruction is the source of our excessiveness. That's what we're excessive about, is our self-destruction.
Yeah. Have you seen the film Phantom Thread?
I have seen Phantom
Yeah,
Thread.
right. So I mean, it's like it's probably one of my favorites, and it's definitely my favorite of Paul Thomas Anderson, who I'm a
Yeah.
big admirer of. But I wonder there, just to use a film as an example, they have this ideal relationship, and then, the dream comes to such a fervor that the death drive, sort of beckons its head, and she has to sort of symbolically kill him for a moment to sort of dampen this whole idealist or romantic arrangement, which is like too much. It's an excess in
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Do you think that such a thing, like in that relationship, is actually productive for them? Right, it's a move away from some sort of strange
Absolutely.
ideal hysteria. But do you think that's a moment of like positive excess within a relationship, which is actually really good? But like, if that film was within, like, I don't know, a more, let's say, commodified setting, she might have, like, I don't know, gone off and gone on the go-karts and drank some Coke Zero or something, right? To, like, instead of doing that. So do you think that's maybe a good example of the
A
split?
great example, James. It's a great example. Yeah, I think I underrated that film, because that what you just said makes that really perfect, right? Like, it really, and I think that's like my reason for feeling like positive about things, is that I do think like the death drive always has its revenge, right? Like you can only make so many Deadpool and Wolverines, and then like it's coming along. It's always coming back to introduce like limit and form and destruction, right? I mean, the question is like, will it be like the destruction of the planet, or will it be like a destruction that we can then work from, right? Like, I think that's the real, to me, that's the real question today. Yeah.
The real question is whether or not, so that
Like, what form is death drive going to take, right? Like, is it going to take like this whole destruction of the planet? Maybe.
Yeah.
Right? Or is it going to be this destruction of like the kind you just mentioned in Phantom Thread, that allows us to go on, like, grasping the importance of the limit, and then, because I think that's the key to fighting climate destruction, is grasping the importance of the limit, right? Like, that's I mean, it seems to me obvious that that's why like it's just the pure excess is what we're suffocating on.
Yeah. It seems very nefarious then that certain films and certain media, Marvel again, it's sort of worse. Not that death happens, which is completely, should deal with it, and not that maybe the death was drawn out, but the death didn't matter. When you
It doesn't
felt,
matter.
yeah, which isn't death at all.
Right. And even I think with somebody I like, Christopher Nolan, sort of falls for this in the last Dark Knight movie, right? Like, it's just like he sacrifices himself to save Gotham, and then he's miraculously alive in an Italian cafe at the end. And you're like, what? How did that happen? But it's just because and it's just because we don't want to kill off Batman. So I feel like that's really, yeah, I feel like that's, yeah, that's that those films are really contribute. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like, you could say, like, it's not because those films like use so much carbon in the making of them. No, it's like what they're saying is so destructive, I think.
So how do we get off that path and move towards basically, I guess, sitting with our own death drive and sitting with our own.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that's the whole question. And I know you said like I make a more of a move to praxis in this book, but I mean, I don't know how that's like, what is the trigger for that, right? Like, I don't know what the trigger for that is. And I don't think you can say what the trigger for that is for any person or for the society as a whole, because I think those are two different questions, right? Like, what's going to trigger some individual to change is something that's completely, it could be like reading a certain book. It could be watching a certain film. It could be watching a certain, like, maybe they saw the end of Sopranos and something shifted in them, right? Like, or maybe they saw maybe they watched Out of the Past and something shifted. But that's a great film noir, by the way. Um, but but it could be like collectively, who knows what it could be? Like it could be like in the US, we just had the shooting of a healthcare executive right in the middle of New York City.
Yeah.
And for a while there was and it was a fascinating thing to watch because obviously I'm against people being shot in the middle of the street. Um but what's fascinating was the response to it, right? Like there was this whole collective sort of identification with the shooter, and then at the same time, the mass media, both like liberal journalists and right wing journalists, all just like laid into him, and even to people who were thinking he was a hero. And
Mhm.
what's fascinating is the collective spirit of the action. So a worker at McDonald's turned him in, and
Mhm.
then on all these people, like thousands of people, went on Yelp and gave that McDonald's a 1-star rating, and they said
Mhm.
it's infested with rats. Don't go here. And I thought it's like what a great thing, right? Like that was just such a. I mean, it was clever, obviously, but I think like who knows what it could be
Yeah.
that then like again, this is like it's terrible to have a person shot in the street, but if you never know what it's like, no one knew that storming the Bastille would be the thing that like triggered this whole
Yeah.
global change in French society. And, a couple people, not a lot of people, but a couple people died in that. So it's not, and I think we could look back on it and say, oh, that was those two people that died or three people died. That was a terrible thing. But we don't look at it like that. We look at it like that was the start of a incredible global change. And so I don't think you ever know what can be that thing that triggers collectively people to come around on. And I think when there are these major movements, I think it almost always is, especially again if they're against capital. It's about grasping the importance of like lack
Mhm.
and death drive. What you just said.
Just to play devil's advocate, sort of brief, or capitalism's advocate briefly, many people would say, well, if you're talking about use value and uselessness, you know, in moving away from the free market system, which many would argue, and you would argue, is sort of abusing that excess for its own empty gain. What is it to say what is and isn't of use outside of that system? Like, who's deciding that, or is that a question that it's, am I asking a very amateur question there?
No, I think that's a good question, and I think like that. Well, I mean, I think what is abuse like? I think it comes down to I don't mean to sort of say the same thing in response to every question, but I'm gonna do that. I feel like it comes down to the relationship between the excessiveness and the lack that's attached to it, right? Like is what's abusive is the attempt, and I think this is the source of almost every form of oppression. I really think like I want to have an experience of excess without suffering anything for it myself. I want to push all the suffering of my excess onto someone else. That's how I define oppression,
Mhm.
right? Like that's what I mean. The simplest example would be slavery, right? Like I like enslave the other person, and I push all the. I say like that person's going to have all the lack. I'm going to exist in pure excess. And Hegel's dialectic of the master and the servant is an attempt to show, yeah, that doesn't really work that way. Like you're still, even the person in this position of mastery still suffers from some kind of lack in order to even have the relationship with the servant. So I feel like but that's how I would define oppression
Yeah.
exactly through these two concepts.
So really, we should all suffer together.
Yes, exactly. And I think that makes sense, right? Like when I see I see where I work at University of Vermont, like obviously there we have janitors, right? And I think like would it be a better system where okay, like every professor also has to it would only take like what once a month or something has to clean out the bathrooms on their floor or whatever that seems like that would be a fine system, right? So that's what that seems to me like a way of thinking about it that obviously whatever, that wouldn't be a universal reform, but it's a way of thinking about suffering together. Like these unenviable tasks that we have, we don't just slough them off on the lowest, the lumpen proletariat. Instead, we share them.
Hmm.
Or we pay them more, right? Like you get paid more. Like we invert everything about the way pay works. Like if you really are one of these people that wants to work on Wall Street, okay, that's fine. Minimum wage, right? Like you don't hardly get anything. But if you're working as like a garbage for a janitor or like picking fruit, like you're just raking in the bucks, right? Like that seems to me like that kind of reversal. Professors would be way down on the because we have it made. So I think like that would be one way to think of like the shared suffering, and like we're going to share the suffering for our shared excess.
Mm. Are you okay for time?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to draw this in just because, I know that you've recorded the interview with her and also recorded, I think, part of her course as well. And I also interviewed her recently, Julia Escher.
Yeah.
Do you see this as connected to this positive excess would really be, the death drive excess is really what we would consider to be the negative. But this book is an attempt to put a positive spin on it. Maybe that's a way out.
I think she would not like that. Yeah.
Why not? Why not?
Well, I think like she so stresses the negativity that I think she thinks. I mean, we're actually co-editing a book together, so I'm very friendly with her. But I think she would think that I'm a little too positive about things because I think not only is Death Drive this radical negativity, but for me, it's also the source of all the like this excess in the positive, most positive sense as well. So it's not just a like it is destruction, but it's also, the source of everything that makes life satisfying for us.
Well, yeah, it's without that destruction is once again, we're just back to content.
Right. We just have to James, I love the way you put that because it really clicked something for me that like Death Drive is this destructive form that then saves us from this barrage of pure content. Right. And I think, and the fact that Marvel is like we're overflowed with pure content is really, I think, a good way to think of it. Like there's just more and more, there's just, and Coke Zero, it's just content. But the bottle, it comes in a bottle, right? Like there's the form, right? And I think,
balls of Coke. Dude, you gotta have the can. It's
the
gotta
can, okay,
it's
good,
gotta have
the can,
crack,
fine.
Yeah,
the crack. I agree. But whatever. My point is there's some kind of limiting structure there, right? And that I think, like if we're gonna like we need to think about Coke Zero through the can, right? Or through the can, not just as in terms of the object. Because if we think of it just in terms of the object, then it only is content, and that's how capital wants us to see it. And if we think about the can as a source of value, and just like you said, the crack, right? Like like no one, my son, he leaves half drunk Cokes in the refrigerator. Like, but they're already open. The can's open. And I'm like, what? Just pour it out, man. It's lost all value now.
Yeah, you're not going to come back to it.
Yeah, of course he does. But what happens to it is I knock it over while I'm reaching for something else. And then I have to clean up. It's just it's a little game we keep playing that again and again. But it's because, I mean, it is an interesting thing, right? Like that, the opened thing is just reduced to its pure use, and then it no longer. But I think the limit of the form of the can really is like that is the thing that all this pure content requires that, and if we start to see that, that's I think a crucial step in struggling against this overflow of pure content.
Yeah. Can I bring in some Wilhelm Reich onto this? Just to
For sure.
So because I love Reich, and I just see Reich in this completely. Because Reich would say like, Freud, Reich goes to Freud, and Freud said, "Look, all my patients have got sex lives. Like, don't worry about it." And Reich goes, "Well, let me look at them." Right? And he's like, "This guy's like jerking off like 10 times a day. This guy can't get it up." He's like, "They've all got problems." And one of the things Reich would say is like, if you have to do this like over and over and over and over again, it's clearly not fulfilling a key aim. It's not giving you a catharsis. It's not giving you like this like what he would say that I think it's for him the fourth stage of Freud's orgasm theory, which is like the release, the like sit back and some tension is released. And so capitalism is like keeping everyone. You just keep drinking Coke, right? So nothing. There's like zero friction, and I don't know where Reich or Freud would go to say, well, hang on, if you keep doing that, surely something has to give, but maybe not. Maybe it's just ticking you over until the day you die.
Well, I think that they both think that that's what drives you into analysis, right? Like I think that that's what they think, that it drives you into analysis. But I do think that's exactly right. Like that's exactly how capitalism functions. And I do think because if you're really satisfied with a commodity or a product, you don't need to get another one. You're like, I'm good, right? Like, and I think our computers are so interesting and phones are so interesting in this way because they're like our school buys us a new computer every 4 years because rightfully so, because the one that we have is no longer no longer functions after 4. They can't get on the internet, right, and all this stuff. So I feel like that notion of planned obsolescence is exactly what you're talking about with this example of someone that has to masturbate 10 times a day, right? Like that's what planned obsolescence is. It's like we're going to get you masturbating 10 times a day, and even that's not enough. You're going to feel like this impulse to do it more.
But also, if you didn't,
I think that's completely right.
If that mechanism wasn't there, though, that plan was also, which is like enough of a aesthetic overhaul to be like, oh, new thing, right?
Yeah.
Which then, of course, speeds up. But if that wasn't there, maybe something would break. So maybe we need to stick with capitalism excess, but they never change the branding. And like you get Coke Zero, but we're not changing the can for the next forever.
Maybe, you're never allowed to change the can. Like it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to introduce certain laws like that? Like pick your aesthetics very carefully because you're never allowed to change it in the history of I think little laws like that would be more like that would do more to upset the capitalist structure than like the 1917 revolution. I mean, I really, that's probably too extreme, but I think like but I really do think that would have an effect because that notion of the new that isn't really that new at all is essential to that creation of pure excess and to our investment in it, right? Like it requires everyone's investment, and that's what's so crucial. So if you withdraw your investment, then that all of a sudden gets upset, I think.
I mean, I thought this was going to happen with the Marvel films, because they did that thing in like the early 2000s where they were like, okay, this is successful, and they brought out that chart of like, here's 2026, here's 2027, right? Like, I remember thinking, surely if you're a fan, you'd see that and go like, all right, I can kind of transparently see that this is just like nothing now, like, I don't know. So I don't know, maybe that's me being pessimistic, but
No, I think that's, I know. So maybe it's hard. It's really hard to get people to come to that insight. Although one thing that gives me hope is I ask my students this all the time. They all have a hatred of their phone. They hate it because of this. I think because it has this promise of pure excess, and they can't get it. They can never stop with it.
I think it's excess to the point where you notice. I think excess to the point where you're not even engaging with like the content, be the equivalent of like just flicking through a book and not looking at the pages, and you become aware of just your actions, right? Like it's like if you see yourself like scrolling like that, it's like not a good.
I know. Plus, you find you've spent 3 hours doing it. You're like, what have I done with myself, right? Like, I think that's.
Are you a smartphone man, or do you just?
I do have a smartphone. Yeah. I mean, it's almost impossible. This is the thing, right? Like, you can't. I don't know if you could fly or do all these things without one, right? Like you can't. Our local theater, you can barely go to the theater without one. So
without seeming conspiratorial, it does seem like you can, but we're gonna make it. So, we're not gonna make it like illegal, but we're gonna make it so difficult that you're not gonna want to do anything. Like I'm not gonna drive to the bank. There's no banks anymore. Yeah. Well, there we go. Anything you want to add about pure excess?
No, I think we covered it mostly. I think it's
Okay. So you're now working on a book on Death Drive, and then you're editing one with Julie Rush.
Yeah, with Julie. She's doing all the work. I'm just
What's that?
That's also on. It's like negativity and psychoanalysis or something like that. Oh no, I think it's called Love and Death and something like that. Something
And then you've and then you got this other one on the Death Drive.
Yeah, and then Death Drive's kind of on the deck, but I have the two things that are coming out before that is I have a book on I think I told you this before that Cambridge my friend Maury Rudy, before she died, asked me to co-write this Cambridge introduction to
Mm.
Jacques Lacan, and so I agreed. And then she didn't finish any of her part, and then she died, which was very sad. But Cambridge said, "Would you finish it?" And I did finish it. So that will come out next year, I think. And then I have another book on Hegel.
Another book on Hegel. More excess.
More, I know. I'm the worst culprit of this pure excess myself.
But yeah, but will that maybe? You've said before that you write another book, right? Much like Zizek says that, rather that's his meaning, his writing. I mean, what happens when that ends? That's just the end of you, I guess.
Yeah, I think I will. I mean, I don't know, because my mom had Alzheimer's, and so I guess I could still write books if I have Alzheimer's. I just keep writing the same one over and over again, which maybe I'm already doing. But yeah, I can't imagine a time when I retire from that. Right? Like it's just unimaginable for me, because it's just what I do it's as much as I couldn't even go to sleep if I wasn't working on a book. That's how. It's funny, when I was a kid, this is so stupid, and I feel ashamed for telling this as a public story, but when I was a kid, I used to think of little sexual fantasies and fall asleep, like teenager or whatever. But now my fantasies are all about the books that I'm working on. Like, oh, how do I work that chapter out? And if I don't have that, I can't fall asleep. So
is this what it's to do with the content of the actual?
Yeah, like working out, okay, this chapter, what's it going to try to say? And so I've thought them all out, right before, then I forget what I come. So it doesn't help, but it's just a way. It's just a pure soporific for me.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a stupid detail. Sorry.
No. I know. I think it's a good detail though, because it shows that it's not really the actual. Are you that interested in when you get the book in your hand?
No, meaningless.
Yeah.
Meaningless to me. I mean, I enjoy conversations like the one we're having, but I don't hold the book and then.
What about the first book? Did you have that with your first book?
No, not even the first one. Okay. No, the first one I was ashamed of from the beginning.
Which one was that?
It's called The Feminine No. Hopefully no one has it, or it's a terrible book. But yeah, I mean, this one I'm not ashamed of, I guess, but I don't have any investment in the actual thing. It's just, the only thing that makes me happy when I get the book is if I've dedicated to someone that I think will be surprised.
This one had so many dedications.
So 2 pages. Yeah. But a lot of people looked at it. Okay. And I try to, ever since my book on comedy, I try to be a little funny in the acknowledgments, so to greater or lesser success. But the person who it's dedicated to, I dedicated Capitalism and Desire to a woman who was she 90 yet? No, she's 86 something, but she's a good friend of mine. And I'm like, I hope she stays alive till I can hand it to her. And then I remember this so well. She was in my office, and she looked, and she's like, oh, that, I had written an inscription.
Yeah.
But it was actually dedicated to her. So she looked at my written, she's like, that's really nice. I'm like, no, read this page. And then she started to cry. And so that part I enjoyed. But otherwise, the actual book itself, part of it is, I don't know, I'm afraid I'll find some error in it, and then that'll be upsetting to me. And
do you think you're also done with whatever was?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. For sure. That's no longer a problem for me. Right. I mean, it is, but what's interesting is when I have a conversation with you, or with anyone like that, it becomes a problem, because what I like is that people point out things that seem like not to make sense to them, or it seemed like they need to be worked through a little bit more. And so that's why that's kind of fun for me, this kind of activity. It's not like I'm going back into the book and because just like it kind of ties to what we're saying, right? It's become just a pure excess now. There's nothing, it no longer, my struggle is no longer in it. So, until I have a conversation, when someone reintroduces a lack, then I'm like, oh, okay, now I got to work through that again. So so that's really.
And that process never ends.
No, that part never ends. I agree.
Do you think anyone who says that part ends is lying?
Yes. Yeah. Because no one feels like you've definitively refuted all critics. Right? No one, Plato didn't feel like that. No one feels like that, I don't think. And if you do feel like that, you're psychotic.
Yeah.
So it's not great.
Well, I'll be sure to put the links for the book in the description below. And I look forward to talking to you about the Death Star book when it's released.
James, thanks so much for having me on.
And
Man.
Happy New Year and a Happy New Year.
Oh yeah, to you too.